In this talk, I want to discuss entryism. Entryism is a strategy of infiltration whereby a group joins and attempts to gain control of an established political party in order to make it a platform for the infiltrating group's favoured policies. Entryism has been discussed quite a bit in British politics in recent years. After Jeremy Corbyn's unexpected accession to the leadership of the Labour Party, the grassroots socialist organisation Momentum was founded to support him. Corbyn's leadership coincided with a huge increase in Labour Party membership, and at the same time, Momentum-supported candidates became powerful within Labour, drawing accusations of entryism from some Labour MPs. Of course, entryism goes back a long way in the Labour Party. The tactic was famously associated with the militant tendency in the 1980s, whose leaders were expelled from the Labour Party by Neil Kinnock as he tried to make Labour electable after the 1983 Conservative landslide. In fact, entryism, at least as an explicitly recognised strategy, goes back to the 1930s, when its most famous advocate, Leon Trotsky, proposed it to revolutionary communist groups as a way of steering social democratic parties towards Leninism. Here's an extract from one of his letters to British communists considering whether to infiltrate the independent Labour Party. But entryism isn't only a strategy of the left, as the last few years demonstrate. These pictures give you some evidence of entryist tactics among supporters of a hard Brexit, who were encouraged by Brexiteer leaders to infiltrate the Conservative Party. Entryism attracts a great deal of hostility, and even the odd legal prohibition. Trotskyite entryists may openly embrace the label, but those adopting an entryist-like tactics generally try to distance themselves from it. Is that just pragmatism, an effort to dissociate themselves from the explicitly revolutionary politics of Trotsky and his followers and avoid electoral damage or expulsion from the infiltrated parties? Or is there something wrong with entryism itself? That's the question I want to take some steps towards answering here. It's worth clarifying that I'm interested in the features that might explain entryism's bad smell and justify the contempt in which entryist politics are held by so many people, rather than in arriving at a judgment of all things considered moral wrongness or permissibility. One reason for this is that justifications for entryism are going to concern large-scale social ends that will tend to swamp countervailing considerations, so that the question of all things considered morality ends up depending mostly on the importance and best means of attaining those ends, and very little on whether there's anything to be suspicious of about entryism in itself. But still, it seems to me we might reasonably be interested in this last question, not least because it might shed light on wider questions about group membership and control that have application beyond the topic of entryism. Are opponents of entryism just sore losers, or contemptuous winners, or concerned about the risks to their own political aims? Or does their hostility reflect other, less nakedly political concerns or attachments? This is all going to be pretty speculative. I began thinking about this open to the possibility that there would turn out not to be all that much of interest to say, either because there isn't really anything wrong with entryism, or because what's wrong with it is just that it instantiates some familiar, well-understood vice. As it's turned out, I think that what's wrong with entryism is indeed a familiar, though perhaps not particularly well-understood vice. But the problem of the vice is compounded by broader political considerations. Before I get to that explanation, I want to discuss some competing candidate explanations of the problem with entryism. They are as follows. First, you might think that the basic problem is that entryism involves deceiving the members of the infiltrated party, or that it's a kind of theft of party machinery from its proper owners. Alternatively, you might think that entryism involves factionalism, where factionalism, which involves no concern to justify a policy or governmental program beyond a particular constituency, is contrasted with partisanship, which justifies its proposals in the name of the whole polity. Or, relatedly, you might think that entryism, even if it's not necessarily factionalistic, undermines the value of political parties in democratic societies. Although all of these explanations have their attractions, I'm going to suggest that none of them is quite right, though the last one provides part of the story. Let's start with the first, deceit. It's easy to see why deceit might seem to be the problem, especially when the leaders of groups that publicly repudiate entryism seem to be privately urging their members to adopt entryist tactics. But entryists need not be deceitful. Militant Tendency in the 1980s and Aaron Banks's Leave EU more recently were pretty open about their intentions, for example. And Trotsky himself seems to suggest that entryists should be open enough about their ideas and plans for the infiltrated party's leaders to be in a position to demand that they renounce them. He also argues that entry would be inadmissible in that case, and emphasizes fighting for revolutionary views within the infiltrated party on the basis of the party statutes and within the limits of party discipline. All this undermines the suggestion that entryism has to involve any kind of deceitful misrepresentation, and yet the publicity of entryists' intentions doesn't seem to have reduced the general suspicion in which the entryism is held. Something similar can be said in response to the suggestion that what's wrong with entryism is that it's a kind of theft, that is, of the infiltrated party's assets, such as funds and mailing lists and the trust of unthinking voters, from their proper owners. Although entryists hope to take over party governance in order to steer it in their favoured direction, they can do this in a way that is entirely compliant with law and party rules. Again, as we saw, Trotsky himself advises fighting within the infiltrated party for revolutionary positions on the basis of the party statutes and within the limits of party discipline. Entryism can simply be a matter of bringing greater numbers to bear in a democratically run party. It's hard to see this as theft in any straightforward sense that could explain what's supposed to be wrong with it. So I'm going to set that suggestion aside. What about the idea that entryism is a kind of factionalism, as contrasted with the more appropriate partisanship? The distinction between partisanship and factionalism has a long history in political thought. On Jonathan White and Leah Yippie's recent presentation of it, the key difference between parties and factions is roughly that the former aspire to articulate and pursue the good of the whole polity, whereas the latter aspire only to advance only the interests of a part. So the worry about entryism as factionalism would be that the value of the infiltrated party as a party rather than a faction would be undermined by the success of the entryist strategy. I'm going to have more to say about the value of parties and partisanship in a moment, but we don't need to go into that to address this form of the objection to entryism. For it's obvious that there's no particular reason to think that entryism has to be a kind of factionalism in the relevant sense. Perhaps revolutionary Marxists could justifiably be thought of in that way, as having the revolutionary aim of advancing the interests of the working class in particular via takeover of the infiltrated party. But even that might be disputed, and it's very hard to see why other entryists, such as the Brexiteers joining the Conservatives, must be regarded as factionalist rather than partisan in the relevant sense. Moreover, as White and Yippie note, it's hardly obvious that real-life political parties are entirely non-factionalist themselves. So even if the charge of factionalism makes sense of hostility to some entryists, I don't think it's going to offer a satisfactory account of what's wrong with entryism in general. A very similar point might be made in response to the objection that entryism threatens to undermine the value of political parties insofar as the value of political parties is understood in the kinds of terms that defenders of partisanship such as White and Yippie propose. White and Yippie's proposal is that partisanship promotes political commitment, that is, commitment to political projects, which in turn promotes citizen authorship of the coercive laws and institutions that structure the state, enhancing their legitimacy. As White and Yippie say, committed agents do not simply put up with rules and institutions that fail to live up to their ideals. They do not simply follow the lead of others. They practice activist citizenship by seeking to reform or change institutions so as to see such ideals reflected in practice. And partisanship promotes political commitment because parties provide important resources, motivation, and epistemic benefits that help to sustain it. Being part of a faction might help to sustain more revolutionary commitments, of course, but insofar as democratic authorship requires those in power to be pursuing a program that at least purports to be for the common good, rather than for the interests of those in power, factions don't provide support for the political commitments that promote democratic legitimacy. Now, insofar as entryists need not be factionalistic, as we saw a moment ago, there's no particular reason to think they undermine the democratic value of political parties. You can see how White and Yippie's account might provide some reason to prefer that entryists just set up their own party rather than infiltrate another. All other things equal, more parties would seem to imply more support for a wider variety of political commitments. But of course, entryists typically adopt the entryist strategy precisely because they don't have much hope of setting up a successful party to rival the parties they infiltrate. And that suggests that all other things aren't really equal here. At the same time, entryists typically try to infiltrate parties with whose political platforms they are, at least in a broad sense, sympathetic. So it's hard to argue that they are simply depriving democratic politics of a partisan option, reducing the availability of vehicles for political commitment. But perhaps there is a more subtle version of this complaint about entryism to be made. The complaint would be that entryists intend to play a role in the infiltrated party that does not put them in the relationship to existing party members that is supportive of political commitment in the way that gives political parties their democratic value. Many of the resource, motivational, and epistemic benefits of political parties depend upon party members' sense of engagement in a shared project. If long-standing party members view new members with suspicion, regarding them as would-be usurpers rather than comrades, the party may become dysfunctional, and the members on both sides may become disaffected, so that the party ceases to be the locus of support that it should be for the political commitments of its members. Internal factionalism can be as corrosive to political parties' legitimacy in the eyes of their members as factional government can be in the eyes of its citizens. I think this explanation is on the right track, but there is something odd about it. As I said a moment ago, entryists typically try to infiltrate parties whose political platforms they broadly share. And there will almost always be long-standing members of the party who are sympathetic to the political program of the entryist group, whether or not they are sympathetic to the entryist's tactics. So even if the proposed explanation makes decent sense of what's wrong with, say, hard left entryists taking over the Conservative Party or hard right Brexiteers taking over the Labour Party, it doesn't seem very satisfying as an explanation for more familiar forms of entryism. There's a risk of a kind of bootstrapping here. What's wrong with entryism is supposed to be that it undermines the partisan value of the infiltrated political party, and it does that because it corrodes the essential relations of trust between party members. But is the suspicion in which entryists are held, as a result of which trust is corroded, justified? Either it is or it isn't. If it isn't, then there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with entryism except that long-standing party members don't like the entryists, which doesn't seem an adequate explanation. On the other hand, if it is justified, then the explanation had better not simply be that entryists corrode trust, because they corrode trust only insofar as long-standing party members are suspicious of them. So if that's all there is to say, then the suspicion is self-justifying, and that doesn't seem satisfactory. We might draw an analogy here with people who argue that immigration should be limited because it corrodes essential relations of solidarity between citizens, though the reason it does that might merely be that the citizens are hostile to immigrants. It should be acknowledged that some party members may be hostile to entryists because they recognise that the unfounded reactions of others will tend to corrode relations between party members in general, even as they acknowledge that there's nothing wrong with the entryism in itself. This is a respectable justification, it seems to me. But it retains an unsatisfactory castles in the air quality even so. I don't think party members' suspicions are self-justifying, but as we've just seen, the justification for them can't unproblematically be that entryists corrode trust between party members. Yet I do think there's something wrong with entryism, and that the way in which it can corrode trust between party members is a relevant part of the full explanation of entryism's particular objectionableness. The basic idea I want to propose is that entryists exhibit a distinctive kind of disrespect for party members that is of a piece with the attitude a child shows others whose game he takes over, say who takes over their sandcastle building project on a public beach and starts ordering them around. It is hard to argue that the children have any kind of property right in the sandcastle. If you're inclined to believe in some sort of temporary Lockean property right here, then just suppose that the game doesn't involve anything tangible that could plausibly qualify as anyone's property. The child's behaviour is obviously inconsiderate, but the reason that it's inconsiderate is that we tend to care about the things we have created or helped to create, and about our ongoing engagement with them in a way that renders us emotionally vulnerable to their fate in various ways. As work by Joseph Raz and Samuel Scheffler brings out, engagement with value has important conservative dimensions, so taking over the game can be expected to be upsetting for its original participants. This same conservatism helps to explain what can be upsetting about sudden infusions of many newcomers with different ideas into any group, say a game or a club or a workplace, even though the newcomers may be completely in sympathy with the general means and aims of the group and may not seek change or power themselves after joining. Often, at least a bit of our conception of our lives and our well-being is wrapped up in such groups, and we experience disorientation and a sense of genuine loss when rapid change disrupts the group and our place within it. Of course, in most cases, there is nothing wrong with the newcomers' participation, and we feel petty for resenting their intrusion. And soon enough we get over it, coming to see the change as part of the story of an ongoing project that retains its value for us and its significance in our lives, just as the children might if the newcomer plays nicely, so to speak. But entryists infiltrate parties with the explicit intention of bringing about changes that will fundamentally alter the party's program and disrupt existing members' standing with respect to it. That is, they intend not to play nicely. They have no particular respect for the party as it is, or for the relations of control that existing party members have towards it. And so they are in that sense inconsiderate of what the party does for existing members, the vehicle of political commitment and friendship that it provides them with. Their interest in how it can serve their ends is not moderated by sensitivity to these things. It's this attitude that justifies suspicion on the part of existing party members, and as a result of which, entryism tends to corrode trust between party members. Why wouldn't you distrust someone who joined your group with an openly professed disregard for your position within or views about it? It's quite natural to put this point in familiar Kantian terms. Entryists treat existing party members as mere means, viewing their collective agency to some extent as material to be strategically shaped or framed by the entryist's agency, in Warren Quinn's memorable phrase. That seems apposite enough, but I'm not sure how illuminating it is, since there seem to be examples of this kind of attitude that aren't particularly troubling, and in any case, entryists can be perfectly respectful of the rights of existing party members. It seems more illuminating to say that the problem with taking other people's projects over in general is that it involves a certain kind of insensitivity to the value their engagement with those projects has for them, and that this is why it counts as treating them as mere means, not the other way round. In many cases, of course, the behaviour in question represents a pretty minor moral problem, as things go. But the significance that a political party has for its members will often be much greater than the significance of a game for its players or a sandcastle for its builders, for example. Moreover, its having this significance for its members enables it to play the wider role in supporting democratic legitimacy that White and Yippie identify. So we can say that what's wrong with entryism is both this insensitivity involved, which is greater or more objectionable than the insensitivity involved in taking over a game, and the tendency to undermine the political value of the infiltrated party as a result of the distrust it creates between members, which distrust is now shown to be well-grounded rather than purportedly self-justifying, and so not itself suspicious as part of the explanation of the wrong of entryism. So that's what I tentatively suggest is wrong with entryism, if anything is. Party members justifiably view entryists with suspicion because entryists exhibit the sort of insensitivity to members' cares and attachments that characterises domineering children on beaches, and a lot more is at stake for them than it is for the children. Moreover, insofar as entryism fosters division and dysfunction within the infiltrated party, it threatens the wider political value of political partisanship as instantiated in the form of that party. As I mentioned near the beginning, I'm hoping to achieve an understanding of the bad smell that accompanies entryism rather than arrive at some all things considered judgment of impermissibility or indeed permissibility. Whether entryism is a defensible strategy in any given context is going to depend on larger questions about the importance of the entryist's political ends, the value of the infiltrated party and its programme, and the nature of democratic legitimacy itself. So mine are very limited conclusions. I also offer them only very, very tentatively, but I hope they'll be at least the basis of an enlightening discussion. Thanks for listening.